All the negotiations over Manx Radio between Tynwald and a Tory government, which was in power for 13 years, were completed only in the nick of time, because in the UK general election of October 1964, the Labour Party under Harold Wilson won a narrow victory over Sir Alec Douglas-Home and the Tories. This was bad news for the UK commercial radio lobby, because the Labour Party regarded radio as a public service and fully intended to protect the monopoly of BBC Radio. They also disapproved, in principle, of commercial radio, and as a result of this policy, Manx Radio was to remain the only commercial radio station operating in the British Isles, not including RTE in Eire, until 1973. The Manx Radio caravan had always been regarded as a temporary arrangement, and by the summer of 1965, far more suitable premises, owned by the Manx politician and businessman Clifford Irving, were rented at the southern end of Douglas Promenade, below an amusement arcade and a billiard saloon, and immediately in front of an aquarium. The new studios were set out and designed by John Grierson, who years later proudly said that he had not seen a better designed station. It worked very well. There were about a dozen staff at the station, the key ones being the engineers. Chief engineer was still Jack Rutter, and to assist him, Grierson now appointed two local youngsters, Ewan Leeming and Charles Webster, and these two were described by Grierson gratefully in retrospect as the two best engineers in the Western world. Ewan Leeming, whose father was an electrical engineer, was appointed first, and a few months afterwards Grierson interviewed Charles Webster, who had worked for the last 9 years with local radio and TV companies and was by now aged 25. He was impressed with Grierson, whom he considered outgoing, ambitious 20 years before his time in broadcasting terms, and a man who spoke his mind. He had a wonderful radio voice, Webster thought, and he could charm the birds off the trees. The three engineers between them built the new studios, which apart from some American turntables with heavy-duty clutches, were fitted with equipment cannibalized from various British products. In addition to the Promenade Studios, Manx Radio also rented an office in Victory House on Prospect Hill, where a lot of the paperwork was done. After the trio of engineers had finished building the new studios, their next task was to move the transmitters from Onchan to a new site at Foxdale. No remote switch was fitted to the 188 transmitter, so Webster and Leeming had to share the task of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and driving from Douglas to Foxdale to switch it on in time for it to warm up for the morning programme. Among the other 10 staff at the station were a number of young presenters whose task was to play records with accompanying cheerful chatter, read news items taken from the local papers, and conduct interviews of various kinds. One of these was Chris Crookall, a Manxman who nevertheless had a pronounced transatlantic accent as a result of being brought up in Canada. Another was Peter Neal, who was born and educated in Douglas. He worked for a time in the garage business, but his main interest, indeed his passion, was sport of all kinds. He was a TT fanatic and would be the chief commentator on the TT for Manx Radio from 1964 to his death in 2002, never missing a race. In the first few years of Manx Radio, the BBC had the official contract to commentate on the races, and the Manx staff were not even allowed into the grandstand. Peter Neal's solution was to borrow the huge commentary box used for the Tynwald ceremony and place it on the side opposite the grandstand. Luckily, Neal was a good friend of Arthur Quinney, the chief timekeeper for the Auto Cycle Union, and after every lap he would quietly pass on the times of the riders, such as Halewood, Agostini and Phil Reed, to young Webster, who ran with them to Neal. In 1966, Manx Radio attempted to go mobile when Jack Rutter, the chief engineer, bought an ex-army ambulance from a firm in North London. He and Webster went across to collect it and discovered that mechanically it was far from sound. Despite precarious brakes, they drove it to Liverpool and onto the ferry, and then took it as quickly as possible to Foxdale and hid it behind a clump of trees in the hope that no one would notice it. Soon after this, Rutter left, and Ray Joyce, who had worked with the Forces Network in Cyprus, joined the station as chief engineer, while the ambulance was sold and eventually replaced by a minivan with Manx Radio written on the side.